Welcome. This is a special news report. Breaking news, at least it was new to us. Something that we had long predicted in the Calexit movement has finally happened. The U.S. government appears to lose its status as the world reserve currency. We'll explain what that means and why the loss of the U.S. Status as the world reserve currency would equal a likely Calexit or California leaving America, and how people have been saying that over the years. We'll get right to it, but first. Special report for the Calexit movement. We have been predicting something like this for a long time. So recently, Saudi Arabia has announced, or it appears that Saudi Arabia has announced, that it will no longer use the US dollar as the reserve currency. So I'm going to let Jimmy Dory explain. Well, actually, it's a clip that he took from someone else explain, but it does a pretty good job. So here we go.
Saudi Arabia's petrodollar exit, a global finance paradigm shift. The financial world is bracing for a significant upheaval following Saudi Arabia's decision not to renew its 50-year petrodollar deal with the United States, which expired on Sunday, June 9th. So I know I talk about the petrodollar. I don't know anyone else who ever brings it up.
We do a lot.
That's why we have such a close relationship with Saudi Arabia. It has a lot to do with why we do a lot of the wars we do, especially Yemen. So here is a explainer. This is Marin Kafusa. I don't know, how do you say that name? Katusa. He's the author of 2014's The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp. So here's just a few minutes that's going to explain it to you better than I can.
The petrodollar is actually a device invented by Kissinger and Nixon.
The standard of living of all Americans can be traced back to here, the vast oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia.
In the early 70s, after the Arab crisis happened with the oil embargoes, OPEC basically tripled the price of oil to the Western world. And at that time, America realized that they were vulnerable because they were importing about 70% of all the oil they consumed.
To secure a reliable foreign source of oil, U.S. President Richard Nixon sent his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia for a secret meeting. The result was a pact that still stands to this day.
If Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the world's largest producer of oil, would sell the oil in U.S. dollars, America would defend Saudi Arabia and make sure the House Assad would stay in power.
As a direct result of this U.S.-Saudi agreement, all other oil-producing nations also adopted the dollar as the de facto medium of exchange. Demand for it increased exponentially all over the world, and soon it had a new name. The petrodollar.
Your currency is only as strong as the demand for it, just like anything else, is supply and demand. Why the petrodollar is important, it causes a demand for the US dollar. A lot of Americans don't realize that. Over 70%.
So that's a quick explanation. So basically, the American standard of living that you've enjoyed is based upon an inflated value for the US dollar. So the US dollar isn't actually worth what it really would be, because everyone in the world has to use the US dollar for any international trade. So if Iran trades with Russia, they have to use the dollar. If North Korea trades with China, they have to use the dollar. So with the BRIC countries, and especially China and Russia, they've been pulling away from that and trying to create an alternative reserve currency. That was dangerous, but it didn't really have the weight behind it. Saudi Arabia, who was the giant that allowed America to create the petrodollar, has now shifted its weight to the BRICS consortium. So Saudi Arabia said that we're not going to use the US dollar as a reserve currency for trade. That's the thing that made America have the reserve currency status. which is what allowed America to inflate the value of the dollar, which is what allows America to be the most powerful and rich country in the world. If the dollar actually has to stand on its own value, it's going to become deflated, and the living standards of Americans will drop drastically because you're basically living higher on the hog, as my grandma used to say, in rural Fresno County. Your dollar's worth more than it's actually worth because everyone in the world uses it. When the demand for the dollar drops, the value of the dollar will drop, and therefore the living standards of Americans will drop. This has been predicted for a long time. It has been feared for a long time. Now I'd like to show you something else, if I may. Okay, so this was the very first speech about Calexit ever given. And I was the one who gave it. This is before there was even Sovereign California or Yes California, before all of that. One second, let me cue this up here. Sorry, we're
first over.
Okay, one second.
Like
Almost.
that, movements like that, is the United States.
Okay, so let me play this for you so you can see exactly what happened. Watch the guy in khakis on the far right. The guy in khakis on the far right is a active or recently retired U.S. Marine. That's right. He's an active or recently retired U.S. Marine. Let's hear what he had to say. Talking about Calexit.
You know, while the Fed or the United States enjoys the world's reserve currency. You know, I'd just like to add that obviously, you know, while the Fed or the United States enjoys the world's reserve currency, you know, something like that, movements like that, if something was to happen to the Federal Reserve note and its role as the reserve currency, you may see movements like this spring up around the country.
So you get the idea. That active duty or recently retired U.S. Marine who's in khaki standing and watching the first Calexit speech said, while the U.S. dollar, the Federal Reserve note, stays the reserve currency, fine, economic stability. If the Federal Reserve note ever loses its status as the reserve currency, you could see movements like this, meaning Calexit, pop up everywhere, meaning across America. He was saying that if the U.S. government lost its status as the reserve currency in the world, you might have secessionist movements take off. He said that in 2012, over 10 years ago, basically 12 years ago. Recently, this week, for the first time, we have confirmation that it appears Saudi Arabia will be pulling out of the petrodollar pact. When you add that on top of China and Russia's recent moves to create an alternative U.S. currency, it doesn't look good for the status of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. It looks like this might be the final death knell, pushing America out of the status of reserve currency for the first time in basically 50 years. It was created in the 1970s. We're in the 2020s now. So for over the last half century, America's enjoyed this status as the global reserve currency holder. If it loses that, it loses economic prowess. It loses the economic empire. It loses the military empire. It loses the standard of living that it's had people believe was standard here in America. When all of that goes and there's that much change, this former U.S. Marine in khaki said that's when you'll see Calexit. Well, that prediction made in 2012 happened this week in 2024. Something to think about. We'll see you soon.